Well, shalom, my name is Todd Bennett, and I'm in Jerusalem, Israel for Passover. And I wanted to address an important issue that many people are being misled about, and that is, what is a Hebrew day, known as a Yom? Well, I understand people's desire to question everything and test all things, but that doesn't mean that everyone can simply throw out what they don't like and decide for themselves what is or what is not truth. Truth is truth, whether you agree with it or not. And just because you decide not to believe it doesn't mean that it's not truth. We're at the time, just like we read about in the Judges. We have no true authority figure, and therefore everyone's doing what seems right in their own eyes. And we read about that in Judges 17:6 and 21:25. In other words, everyone is deciding for themselves what is right and what is wrong, what is truth and what is not. Now this, quite frankly, leads to chaos, and that's what we're observing in the Hebrew Roots movement at the present time, a movement which is supposed to be leading to restoration in truth. Sadly, the enemy is busy throwing people into confusion and keeping people busy chasing down rabbit trails and bickering about created conflicts because people are focusing primarily on obtaining knowledge, and they often forget the spirit in this process of restoration. Yeshua called the set-apart spirit the helper and the spirit of truth in John 15:26. He sent the spirit to guide us in the path of righteousness and to show us truth. So with all this confusion, there are clearly people who are not operating in the spirit. If everybody were walking in the spirit, we would be walking in unity, and there would not be this mess that we see today. Now, interestingly, Yeshua sent the Spirit on the appointed time of Shabbat, and determining when to celebrate Shavuot is another contentious issue in the Hebrew Roots movement. But it really shouldn't be if we simply follow the lead of the Spirit. The Holy Spirit confirmed that we'd keep it just as it was kept during the days of Yeshua, when, according to Acts 2:5, there were dwelling in Jerusalem Yahudim, devout men from every nation under heaven. The reason devout Yahudim were there from every nation under heaven is because they were all on the same calendar, and we know exactly what that calendar was. It was the same calendar that Yeshua was following. They started the Omer count on the day after the first high Sabbath of unleavened bread, which means they started counting on day 16 of month 1. If they were following the Karaite calendar, the Jubilee calendar, the Qumran calendar, the so-called Enoch calendar, or any other calculated solar calendar, they would have missed this very special and important outpouring, which was specifically timed by the Messiah and fulfilled by the Spirit. Now, tradition holds that it occurred at the same time that the Torah was given at Sinai. And we can confirm that Moses and Yisrael observed Shavuot in the same fashion after they arrived at Sinai, and Joshua and Yisrael observed Shavuot in the same fashion after they crossed the Jordan and observed the first Passover in Gilgal. Now, we can be very confident that the temple was following the proper calendar for a number of reasons. First of all, Yeshua, his family, his disciples, they were all attending the feast in Jerusalem along with Yisrael. And Yeshua never made any mention or correction of the calendar, although he made many mentions and corrected the Pharisees and the Sadducees on several other issues. He never talked about correcting them on the calendar. Further, prior to the account of the birth of John the Immerser and Yeshua, we're given some very interesting information about John's parents, as follows in Luke 1:5-6. It says, "There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the division of Abijah. His wife was of the daughters of Aharon, and her name was Elisheva. And they were both righteous before Elohim, walking in all the commandments and ordinance of Yahuwah, blameless." Now, since Zacharias was a priest serving in the temple, there is no way that this statement could be true if the temple was operating on a calendar contrary to the calendar of Yahuwah. His proper service during the feasts, in particular, would require that the temple and Yisrael were on the proper calendar in order for him to be, quote, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of Yahuwah blameless, end quote. It was centuries later, after the destruction of the temple, that the Pharisees changed the calendar and developed what is now known as the Jewish calendar. Up until that time, Yisrael and the temple were operating on the correct calendar. Now, I began this discussion of the day with Shabbat because although it can be the subject of confusion and debate, it also emphasizes the point that the calendar was not in dispute during the time of Yeshua, if we believe the account provided in Acts. Now, regardless, some people are attempting to argue that the calendar was in dispute, and as a result, there are a lot of people promoting lies and spreading confusion, which is causing a considerable amount of division. They're not operating in the spirit, but in the flesh, and they're chasing after calendars that clearly do not subscribe to the mandates of Genesis 1. One of the offshoots of this calendar debate that I'm seeing is the issue of when a day begins. Now, this is so basic and elementary that I can't believe people are actually arguing about it, but it's become a great point of contention and confusion among those leaving mainstream religion and seeking the ancient path of Yahuwah. For those of us who have lived much of our lives under the Gregorian calendar, we used a clock to tell us that a day began at a non-observable time called midnight. So the day began in darkness and went a full cycle until the following midnight. When we began to come out of Babylon, we learned that the Creator reckoned the day differently, and we looked to Genesis 1 for that reckoning. The first thing that we read about is the earth in a state of darkness and desolation. Genesis 1:2 describes the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of Elohim was hovering over the face of the waters. So we're actually reading about a renewal and restoration process that began in darkness, as the Spirit of Elohim was essentially vibrating over the waters. We then read in Genesis 1:3, Elohim said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So it's important to recognize that there was first darkness, and then there was light inserted into creation. This is a pattern which will continue as we examine further the Hebrew day. When we examine the creation account, we see that Elohim divided light from darkness. He called the light day and the darkness night. He then described the two demarcation points between the light and the darkness, namely evening and morning. These are the division points between light and darkness. He then essentially stitched them together into one complete cycle that was described as Yom Echad. Here's a common rendering of Genesis 1:5 from the English translation. Elohim called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. The term first day is Yom Echad. The Hebrew word Yom means day, and the Hebrew word Echad means one or unified. Now recall that when a man and a woman were joined together, they became one, Echad, flesh. We read that in Genesis 2:24. So too with the night and the day. Elohim joined them together as Yom Echad, a unified day, the first day. The day begins at the first demarcation point, the evening. It then progresses through the darkness of night until the second demarcation point, the morning. It then continues through the light period until the next day begins in the following evening. So the day cycle starts from the demarcation point of the evening and flows from evening to evening. This cycle of the day is a fundamental Hebrew concept. Hebrew thought in all creation is very cyclical, and many Westerners have a hard time understanding such things because they've been taught to think linear all their lives. Now, some people have a problem with this concept of a unified day because the light is called Yom, which means day. So they question, how can the light and darkness combined also be called a day? As a result, we have some people thinking linear and claiming that a day is only the light portion of a day. Others understand that the day is a cycle, but they claim that the cycle flows from morning to morning, which they call boker to boker. Well, Genesis 1 clearly teaches to the contrary regarding both of these notions. But if Genesis 1 isn't clear enough, we'll look at a number of scriptures that show how the Yom Echad, the unified day, starts in the evening, and it's not a problem having multiple but related meanings for the same Hebrew word. For instance, just looking at the word Yom, we see that a day can refer to a general period of time, the light portion of a day, or a full day. In fact, the day of Yahweh, or the day of Yahuwah, has been defined as a year by Isaiah, and we read in Isaiah 34:8, "For it is the day of Yahuwah's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion." So a day is a cycle of time that's also been correlated with the cycle of a year, as we see in the Omer day count paralleling the Jubilee year count. We also see the concept of the seventh day, Shabbat, paralleling the seventh year, Shemitah. There are numerous other examples in the scriptures that correlate a day and a year. And finally, a day can even be compared to a millennium, as we read about in 2 Peter. "But beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with Yahuwah 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as is 1 day." 2 Peter 3:8. Now, this is by no means unusual, nor does it pose a problem in the Hebrew language. And take, for example, the word Yisrael. Yisrael can refer to an individual man, 12 different tribes combined as one, Echad, a united nation under one king, or the northern kingdom, after it was divided, referred to as the house of Yisrael. So this one word, Yisrael, describes many different related things. So there shouldn't be a problem with the Hebrew word day, Yom, referring to both the light portion of a day and the complete day, Yom Echad. In fact, it's exactly the same as using Yisrael to refer to a portion of Yisrael consisting of the 10 northern tribes and the unified kingdom of Yisrael as a whole, Yisrael Echad. It actually has deep spiritual significance and meaning, and just as Yisrael will once again become Echad in the New Jerusalem, so the text of Revelation tells us that there will one day be no more night in the New Jerusalem. So the day will be all light in the future, and this will occur when Yeshua returns with his bride. When asked what was the first of the commandments, Yeshua proclaimed, "Hear, O Yisrael, Yahuwah our Elohim, Yahuwah is one." We read that in Mark 12:29. He was quoting a very important prayer and commandment, often called the Shema, found in Deuteronomy or Devarim 6. In Hebrew, it reads, "Shema Yisrael, Yahuwah Eloheinu, Yahuwah Echad." And there's that idea of unification again, dealing with Yahuwah, Yahuwah Echad. Now the commandment continues, "You shall love Yahuwah your Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk along the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up." And we read that in Deuteronomy 6:5-7. Now this essentially lays out how we should always be speaking of the commandments, and notice the rhythm of life that's built into this command. When you lie down and when you rise up. These are the two demarcation points in a day. Again, a day begins in the evening. It turns dark and you prepare to sleep. You speak of him when you lie down at the beginning of the day. You later get up with the sun in the morning, and you speak of the commandments when you rise up. The Shema reinforces the flow from evening to morning. So that commandment, the first commandment, reinforces the scriptural understanding of a day. And of course we know that it's traditional to pray 3 times a day. From Daniel 6:10 we read, "And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his Elohim, as was his custom since early days." King David also prayed 3 times a day, and we read about his daily pattern in Psalm 55:17, which reads, "Evening and morning and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice." So David specifically followed the pattern of the Shema. He started his day in the evening by praying. He then slept through the night and then prayed when he rose up in the morning. He then prayed midway between the morning and the following evening. So David is outlining his prayer cycle through an entire day, just as Daniel would have done. And the text in Daniel specifically states that Daniel prayed 3 times a day. Again, the day starts in the evening with the first prayer and flows through to the morning to the following evening. They were not just praying in the light time. So all throughout the text of Leviticus, we read about the difference between clean and unclean, and the repeated notion that a state of uncleanness continues until evening, when a new day begins. And here's an example found in Leviticus 11:24 through 25. It says, "By these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening." So if you became unclean throughout the day, you needed to wash. And then at evening, when a new day began, you would be considered clean. It's this renewal process that we see over and over again. There's also a specific commandment concerning the payment of wages that reinforces the scriptural concept of a day, found in Deuteronomy 24:14 through 15. It says, "You shall not oppress the hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages, and not let the sun go down on it, for he is poor and has set his heart on it, lest he cry out against you to Yahuwah, and it be sin to you." So here we see a command to pay daily wages before the sun goes down, before the day ends and a new day begins. Another very good example of the day can be found in Nehemiah. When some of the exiles from Yehudah returned from their exile, they began to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and the temple. They also began observing the Shabbat and the appointed times. Now, Nehemiah saw people working on Shabbat, and we read in Nehemiah 13:16, "Men from Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Shabbat to the children of Yehudah and in Jerusalem." As a result, he took action to stop these merchants from profaning the Sabbath by closing the gates of the city before the Sabbath began. And we read about that in Nehemiah 13:19. It says, "So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut, and charged that they must not be opened until after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates, so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day." Now this text is very clear. As it began to be dark before the Sabbath, they shut the gates. The Sabbath starts in the evening in darkness. So they shut the gates before the Sabbath, before it became completely dark. Now there's a very special and unique Sabbath called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where the duration of a day is specifically provided because it's so important. And we read that commandment in Leviticus 23:27 through 32 as follows. "Also the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. It shall be a set-apart convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to Yahuwah. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the Day of Atonement, to make atonement for you before Yahuwah your Elohim. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people. And any person who does any work on that same day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It shall be to you a Shabbat of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening, you shall celebrate the Sabbath." Leviticus 23:27 through 32. So, we know that Yom Kippur is a day, and it occurs on day 10 of month 7. It's not only a day, but it's a Sabbath day. And according to Leviticus 25:9, it's also the beginning of the Jubilee year. So anyone who violates the command gets cut off from their people. And this is a good example of why understanding time and being on the correct calendar is so important. This commandment is so important that it specifically defines the duration of the day. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. So again, we see a day spans from evening to evening. Now, another important appointed time with potential life or death consequences is the Passover. The commandment is that on the 14th day of the first month is the Passover of Yahuwah, Numbers 28:16. So notice that it's a day, but it begins at twilight. The Hebrew phrase translated as twilight is Bein Ha-Arabim. This is a Hebrew concept known as between the evenings, and it describes the two times that begin an evening, sunset to total darkness when the day begins. So the slaughtering process begins at sundown after day 13, which leads into the beginning of day 14 in the evening. Now, all of the requirements of the Passover occurred in the dark, and none of the sacrifice was to be left until morning. According to Numbers 9:12, they shall leave none of it until morning, nor break one of its bones. According to all the ordinance of the Passover, they shall keep it. Now we know the Passover occurs on day 14. It begins between the evenings, and it all occurs at night. Yet, in Exodus 12:14 it says, "This day shall be to you a memorial." It all occurs at night, but it's called a memorial day. So the idea that a day only includes the light time is absurd and contrary to the Scriptures. It would completely nullify the Passover celebration. The period of between the evenings, which marks the beginning of Passover Day, is also important to the calendar as a whole because that's when we sight the new moon, after sunset and before total darkness. As a result, we know before total darkness sets in whether or not the new day also begins a new month. That's how the calendar works properly, and in order to sight the new moon and use the moon for appointed times as prescribed by Genesis 1:14, the day must begin in the evening. In fact, Genesis 1:14 provides, "Then Elohim said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for moedim and for days and for years." So the sun and the moon are there to tell time, and a day is specifically defined 6 times through creation week as flowing from the evening to the morning to the following evening, which would begin the next day. There's one misunderstood comment by Yeshua in John that many people cling to support the notion that a day is only the light portion of a day. Yeshua's disciples asked him why he was returning to Judea when they tried to stone him the last time he was there. His response in John 11:9 was, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world." The problem with using this passage as a definition of a day is that Yeshua was not making some revolutionary statement that a full day only consists of 12 hours of light. Indeed, that would only theoretically occur 2 times a year during the equinoxes with our modern understanding of time and the duration of an hour. In Yeshua's time, a full day was divided into 12 hours of night and 12 hours of light. The hours were not determined in 60-minute durations as they are today. Rather, the duration of an hour varied depending upon its proportional share of the day or the night. So there would always be 12 hours in a day and 12 hours in a night, although those hours might be longer than 60 minutes or shorter than 60 minutes, depending upon the time of year. So Yeshua was not talking about the length of a day or the definition of a day. When read in context, we understand that he was stating, you need to walk in the light and not in darkness, otherwise we stumble. We need to sleep when it's dark and walk when it's light. He was going to bring the light of life to Lazarus, who was sleeping and actually dead. This was all about the resurrection, not redefining a day. In fact, the day cycle from evening to evening is a daily reminder of our life cycle. We begin in the womb in darkness, and then we come into the light. While we're in the light, we need to walk in the light until we return to the dark and sleep. There's no historical or scriptural support for the notion that a day begins in the morning or consists of only the light portion of a day. The scriptural evidence is overwhelming, and I hope by now it's clear that a scriptural day flows from evening to evening. And if you're observing any other reckoning, then you're going to find yourself in trouble, because you'll inevitably end up profaning Sabbaths and violating commandments. This was no small issue in the past, and it's no small issue now. As we look to future fulfillments of the appointed times, diligent obedience and proper observance of time in the calendar could have equally as grave consequences as we read about occurring in the past. I hope that helps you with your understanding of a day. We have the time and calendar series that we're working on that talks in more detail about how to observe the scriptural calendar. We also detail it at length in the book Appointed Times that you can find on our website or Amazon.com. We also have articles that you can download on our website concerning the observance of specific appointed times. So please check out our resources and emails if you have any specific questions. We're here to help. Shalom.